My name is Lara, and I'm writing this because I need to let these stories out. For a bit of context, I'm a medical examiner in a city tucked away in the northern part of the country. It's not glamorous work, and if I'm being honest, it's not something I ever imagined myself doing when I was younger. But life leads you to strange places, doesn't it? I stumbled across this channel one night while I was aimlessly scrolling through videos during a quiet bus ride to work. I'm not the kind of person who seeks out horror content. It's not my thing. But one of your videos popped up, and it was about a morgue experience. That caught my attention because, well, that's my world. The way you approached the topic with seriousness and respect was what pulled me in. It made me feel like maybe I could share some of the things I've experienced at my job, things that still give me chills. A few months ago, we received the body of a little boy. He was only 5, and he'd been killed in a car accident. It was a heartbreaking case. He had been playing with his dog when a ball rolled into the street. He chased after it, and a car couldn't stop in time. The boy's parents weren't home when it happened, so he was brought to us for the usual procedures. That night, after his body was placed in one of the freezers, I decided to grab a late dinner in the break room. I had just unwrapped a sandwich when I heard the sound of running footsteps, tiny ones. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again, soft laughter, high-pitched and full of life. I froze, sandwich halfway to my mouth. It was the kind of sound you don't expect to hear in a place like this. Minutes later, 2 of my co-workers burst into the break room, pale and shaking. They were incoherent at first, just mumbling about a child. I managed to get them to calm down enough to explain, and what they said made my skin crawl. They had been in the autopsy room when they heard someone humming. When they turned around, they saw a little boy crouched on the floor playing with some surgical jars. He was wearing a green shirt and jeans, just like the boy we'd received earlier that day. They said they tried talking to him, but when he turned to face them, they saw the bruises on his temple and the bloodstains on his shirt. That's when it hit them. They were looking at the same boy whose body was supposed to be in the freezer. They ran out of there without looking back. I wanted to dismiss it as a stress-induced hallucination, but their fear was too raw, too real. Later that night, we checked the freezer where the boy's body was stored, and it was still there, unmoved. But in the autopsy room, the jars they mentioned were scattered across the floor. A guard lit a candle and said a prayer for the boy's soul. Since then, we haven't seen him again. But he's not the only child people have reported seeing in the morgue. One time, we received the body of a teenager, just 17 years old. He had been caught in a crossfire and died from multiple gunshot wounds. His family stayed outside the building the entire time we had his body, especially his mother. She was inconsolable, crying so hard it was difficult for us not to feel her pain. The strangest part of that case was during the autopsy. As we worked, we noticed tears slipping from the boy's eyes. It wasn't a trick of light or an illusion. His eyes were crying. It went on for hours, right up until we handed his body back to his mother. Some of my co-workers believe it was a sign of regret, that his soul hadn't found peace. Others said it was just one of those strange things bodies do after death. But it stayed with me, that image of his silent tears. Then, there was the case of a man in his mid-30s. A colleague and I were performing the autopsy while a few medical students observed. It was routine until we were nearly finished. As we stitched the body closed, the man's head lifted. His eyes opened, and he looked down at his chest as though inspecting our work. He held that position for a few seconds before laying back down and closing his eyes. I swear, we all saw it. The students went pale, and my colleague's hands shook as he continued stitching. We tried to explain it as a post-mortem spasm, something caused by gases in the body, but none of us really believed that. The last story I'll share happened on a quiet Saturday night. I was alone in the building, wrapping up my shift. I was in the storage room when I felt it, a presence. I turned and saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman with long, matted hair wearing a tattered dress. Her face was obscured by shadows, but her eyes, they glowed faintly in the dark. I didn't move. I couldn't. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity before slowly turning and walking away. When I finally mustered the courage to follow, the hallway was empty. These are just a few of the things I've witnessed. People say the dead are at peace, but I'm not so sure. Sometimes it feels like they linger, caught between worlds, and sometimes they make sure we know they're still here. The job had always been a strange one, but I'd gotten used to it, or so I thought. My name doesn't matter. Let's just say I worked in a small-town funeral home as an assistant to the mortician. It wasn't the kind of job people dreamed of growing up, but it paid the bills, and I liked the quiet. Death became a routine part of my life. I thought I'd grown numb to its presence. That was until one night proved me wrong. The funeral home was an old Victorian building at the edge of town, with creaky wooden floors and windows that rattled in the wind. Most people in town whispered about it, calling it haunted, but I laughed it off. Ghosts, I'd say, were just stories people told themselves to make sense of things they didn't understand. But after what happened, I'm not so sure anymore. It started like any other late shift. I was alone, going through the evening checklist. The funeral home always felt colder at night, the air heavy and still, like it was holding its breath. The dim glow of the antique wall sconces didn't help, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed alive. I told myself it was just my imagination, as I often did, and focused on my tasks. By 10 o'clock, I was in the prep room, double-checking everything for the next day's service. The room was eerily silent, except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. I moved from one station to the next, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. It wasn't unusual for me to feel on edge during these late shifts, but this night was different. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if something unseen was watching me. I was arranging flowers near the cooling cabinets when I first felt it, a chill brushing the back of my neck. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't the usual cold draft I'd grown accustomed to in the old building. This felt alive. Slowly I turned around, expecting to see nothing but the empty room. Instead, the shadows seemed darker, deeper, and in the corner something shifted. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. There was no answer, just the soft creak of the floorboards as if someone or something was moving. My heart raced, but I forced myself to keep working. It was probably just the wind, I thought, or maybe the building settling. Minutes later, I heard it, a faint, breathy whisper. At first I couldn't make out the words, but then they became clearer. "Help me," it said, barely audible but unmistakable. I dropped the vase I was holding, the crash echoing through the room. My hands shook as I backed away, my eyes scanning every corner for the source of the voice. Nothing, just the flowers strewn across the floor and my own ragged breathing. I tried to convince myself it was just stress, maybe exhaustion. But then the lights began to flicker. The room plunged into darkness for a heartbeat before the lights sputtered back on, dimmer than before. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stumbled toward the exit, but before I could reach the door, a metallic screech made me stop in my tracks. One of the gurneys had started to move. I stared, frozen, as it rolled slowly out of the cabinet. The white sheet covering the body shifted, as though something underneath was trying to push it off. My legs felt like lead, my instincts screaming at me to run, but I couldn't look away. The sheet began to slip, revealing a pale, lifeless hand, and then the lights went out completely. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for its flashlight, but my hands were trembling so badly I could barely grip it. When I finally turned it on, The beam of light sliced through the darkness, landing on the gurney. The sheet was crumpled on the floor, and the body was gone. My chest tightened as the air around me grew colder. I could see my breath in the faint glow of the flashlight. Then I heard it again, louder this time. "Help me." The voice was coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The shadows seemed to ripple, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure. A woman, her face gaunt and eyes hollow, reaching out to me. I didn't wait to see more. I bolted, tripping over my own feet as I raced toward the main hall. The building seemed to twist around me, the corridors stretching and narrowing as if trying to trap me. When I finally burst into the front office, the warm glow of the desk lamp felt like salvation. The night watchman looked up from his magazine, startled. "You okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. What could I say? That I'd just been chased by a ghost? That the dead had started moving? He'd think I was crazy. Maybe I was. I quit the next day. I told the mortician I couldn't handle the late shifts anymore, but I didn't tell him why. I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. I hear the whispers in my dreams, see the flickering lights in the corners of my vision. And sometimes, when it's quiet, I swear I can still feel that chill on the back of my neck. My name is Sasha, and I'm not sure why I feel compelled to write this, but I guess I need to get these memories out of my head. I work as a forensic assistant in a small coastal town, far removed from bustling cities and their constant noise. It's a peaceful place, but the kind of peace that sometimes feels like it's hiding something underneath. A quiet unease that creeps into you when you're alone. I never intended to work in this field. When I was younger, I dreamed of being an artist, painting vivid sunsets and landscapes. But life doesn't always go the way you plan, does it? A series of choices, accidents, and financial realities brought me here, to the sterile halls of the county mortuary. It started on a rainy autumn evening. I was scrolling aimlessly on my phone during a rare lull at work when I stumbled upon a video about eerie happenings in morgues. I don't usually go for creepy content, but something about the way the narrator spoke, calm, respectful, kept me watching. It reminded me of my own experiences, the kind of things I never talked about but couldn't forget. One of those memories is about a young girl, barely 6 years old. Her name was Lily. She had been riding her bike outside her house when a car veered off the road and hit her. It was tragic, the kind of case that sticks with you. Her parents were inconsolable, their grief heavy and suffocating as they identified her body. Later that night, after we had placed her in the cold storage room, I went to grab a coffee in the break room. As I stirred the sugar into my cup, I heard it, a faint giggle, soft and airy like the sound of a child playing. At first I thought it was my imagination, but then came the distinct patter of small footsteps echoing down the tiled hallway. I froze, my coffee untouched. The sound stopped as abruptly as it began, leaving me in a silence so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. I wasn't the only one who noticed strange things that night. 2 of my co-workers burst into the break room a little later, pale as the fluorescent lights above. They were babbling about seeing a child in the viewing room, crouched by a tray of instruments. They said she was wearing a yellow dress, just like Lily had been. When they tried to approach her, she turned her head, revealing bruises on her temple and a deep gash on her forehead, the injuries that had brought her to us. And then, just like that, she was gone. We checked the storage room where her body had been placed. It was undisturbed, everything as it should be. But in the viewing room, the instruments the others had described were scattered across the floor. After that, an older technician lit a candle in Lily's honor, and said a quiet prayer. Maybe it worked because we didn't hear or see anything unusual again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she had been trying to say goodbye one last time. Another memory that haunts me is about a teenage boy. He was just 16 and his name was Jesse. He'd been shot during a mugging gone wrong. The bullet wounds told a horrifying story. He had tried to fight back. His family was devastated, especially his younger sister, who refused to leave the building while we prepared his body. What made this case so unforgettable was what happened during the autopsy. As we worked, we noticed something strange. Tears streaming down his face. At first we thought it was some sort of illusion, maybe condensation. But no, the tears were real. They glistened in the harsh light, carving silent trails down his lifeless cheeks. It went on for hours. Some of the staff said it was a natural reaction, just the body's way of releasing fluids. But I couldn't bring myself to believe that. It felt like something else entirely, like grief, regret, or maybe a final acknowledgement of everything he had lost. Then there was the man. He must have been in his early 40s, his life cut short by a massive heart attack. It was a routine case, no mysteries, no surprises, or so I thought. I was helping stitch him up when it happened. His chest rose, his head jerked forward, and his eyes flew open. He looked straight at me, not through me. At me as if he was trying to tell me something. My heart nearly stopped. The room was dead silent except for the hum of the overhead lights. He stayed like that for what felt like forever, then slowly lay back down, his eyes closing again. We all saw it, even the medical students observing that day. No one spoke for several minutes, and when we finally did, the explanations came quickly. Post-mortem spasms, trapped gases, anything that sounded remotely scientific. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. The last story I'll share is the one that unsettles me the most. It was a Saturday, a quiet one, with most of the staff off for the weekend. I was wrapping up my shift, alone except for the hum of the ventilation system. I was filing paperwork in the storage room when I felt it. A shift in the air, a change in the atmosphere that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned and saw her. A woman stood in the doorway, her hair tangled and wild, her clothes faded and torn. Her face was hidden in the shadows, but her eyes glowed faintly like embers in the dark. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the floor. She didn't say anything, didn't move toward me. She just stared. And then, as quietly as she had appeared, she turned and walked away. When I finally worked up the courage to follow, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, and the building was silent again. I've worked in this field long enough to know that death is never as simple as we want to believe. Some people linger, their presence like a faint whisper in the back of your mind. And sometimes, they make sure you know they're still here, watching, waiting, reminding you that the line between life and death is thinner than we think. It was late one winter evening, the kind of night where the cold seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. My name is Nathaniel, but everyone just calls me Nate. I work as a forensic pathologist, and in all my years on the job, I've seen things that would unsettle even the most hardened souls. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened that night. The storm had been raging for hours, howling winds rattling the windows and heavy rain drumming against the roof of the morgue. Most of the team had cleared out early, anxious to avoid the worst of the weather, leaving me alone in that vast, sterile space. The kind of quiet that falls in a place like that is suffocating, thick and heavy, broken only by the occasional hum of the overhead lights. The case that had come in earlier was tragic. A young woman, 28, pregnant with her first child, had died in a car accident. Her husband had driven her to the hospital in a desperate attempt to save her and the baby. But it had been too late. 2 lives lost in a single cruel instant. Her body lay on the steel table, pale and still beneath a white sheet. I stood over her, staring at the face of someone who had once been full of life and hope. Normally, autopsies could wait until the morning, but something about this case gnawed at me. A strange unease settled in my chest, like an itch I couldn't scratch. It was just past midnight when I began noticing things. At first it was subtle, a fleeting shadow in my peripheral vision, a faint rustling sound that seemed to come from nowhere. I brushed it off, chalking it up to exhaustion. But then I heard it, a cry. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably the cry of a baby. My first instinct was to laugh it off. Babies don't cry in morgues, and they certainly don't cry from the body of a woman who's been dead for hours. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more desperate. Heart pounding, I approached the gurney. My palms were clammy as I pulled back the sheet. What I saw nearly dropped me to my knees. There, nestled against her still body, was a baby. Tiny, fragile, and impossibly alive. It was still attached to her by the umbilical cord, its skin slick with blood and other fluids. Its tiny fists waved in the air, and its cries echoed through the room, sharp and piercing. For a moment I couldn't move, my mind struggling to reconcile the impossible sight before me. With trembling hands I lifted the baby, quickly grabbing a clean cloth to wipe its face. Its eyes fluttered open, dark, deep, and far too knowing for a newborn. I stood there cradling the fragile life in my hands, trying to process what was happening. But just as suddenly as it had begun, the crying stopped. The baby's chest stilled, its tiny body going limp. I panicked, desperately trying to revive it, performing CPR with a precision I didn't even know I possessed. Minutes stretched into eternity as I fought to keep it alive. But it was no use. The baby was gone. I was still holding the lifeless body when the room grew unbearably cold. Lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to shift and writhe across the walls. Then I heard them. Whispers. At first, they were faint. A soft murmuring that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But they grew louder, more insistent. A chaotic chorus of voices that I couldn't understand, but felt deep in my gut. And then, the baby's cry returned. It was louder this time, more anguished, as if coming from the very air around me. I looked down at the tiny body in my arms. It wasn't moving, its chest still, its eyes closed. Yet the cries persisted, filling the room until they became unbearable. The nauseating stench of decay hit me, thick and cloying, and I gagged, stumbling backward. When I turned toward the woman's body, my breath caught in my throat. Her eyes were open. They stared directly at me, wide and unblinking, filled with something that looked like despair, or perhaps anger. My legs felt like lead, my entire body frozen as those lifeless eyes bore into mine. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, a cacophony of anguish and rage that seemed to seep into my very soul. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting into shapes that defied logic, and the air felt thick, oppressive, like it was pressing down on me. I don't know how I found the strength to move, but somehow I managed to stumble out of the room. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling like a beast, as I fumbled with my car keys and drove away, not daring to look back. I never returned to that morgue. I told myself it was the stress, the exhaustion, maybe even a hallucination brought on by too many sleepless nights. But deep down, I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know I'll never forget the sight of those eyes staring back at me, or the cries of a baby that should never have been born.